Today we're going to have kind of an overview and an introduction to rehabilitation counseling, and we're going to go back and cover many of the points that I've raised in this presentation, but I thought that it would be helpful if we sort of have a very general overview of where we came from and where we've been and perhaps even where we're headed, and some of the issues that are present, that are current with regard to the field and to rehabilitation counseling practice. So let me start by going over what I would consider the foundations of rehabilitation counseling. And to do that, we really need to go back, I would say, to the middle of the 1800s or slightly after that. And really, if we're looking at starting to say when did rehabilitation counseling start, I would say we'd have to go back to right after the Civil War in around 1870 or so, at the time of the Industrial Revolution. And it was really the Civil War that prompted the Industrial Revolution. And it was at that time when society began to move from being an agrarian-based society, a farming-based society, to an industrial society. So if we go back to the time of, I'd say around 1870, that part of the 19th century, there were several influences that occurred that laid a foundation for rehabilitation counseling. And one was industrialization, where you had the development of industries in this country and in other countries as well. What the development of industries did was that it led to urbanization, because people would leave their communities, leave their homes, and migrate to the cities which were developing and which had many of the industries. And what we also had during this time was a tremendous wave of immigration. And in part, that wave of immigration was prompted by the fact that industries needed a workforce to keep them going, to maintain them. And so what we had was the three factors of industrialization, urbanization, and immigration coming together, and you had the breakdown of not just the agrarian lifestyle, but also the breakdown of the extended family. What you had when you had an extended family, you had the situation in which family members would take care of themselves. So if you had somebody who has a disability or an illness, then you would have the family member or the family being responsible for that family member. And when that broke down and you had people living in urban environments in which perhaps people didn't really even know their neighbors, you didn't have that extended family. And so that's where you had the beginning of a social network, or a requirement for a social network. And we'll talk about that as we proceed. In addition to these factors, other things began happening. There were advances in medicine, there were advances in education, in psychology, technology, and then objective testing, which I suppose you could put together with education and psychology. Advances in these areas had an impact on rehabilitation. And it's not as if one impacted the other, it's the interrelationship between all of these factors. Advances in medicine led to people living longer and being able to function after having an injury or after having a disability, or even having a disability that was congenital or developmental. The advances that occurred with industrialization required specialization, that it required people with knowledge of how to build machinery, how to maintain machinery, how to operate it, for example. And that led to, obviously, the need to train people. That sort of technology led to people having to know how to do those functions. And I'm kind of, being very broad in explaining this. And one of the ways in which we determined who would be good at building and designing machines, and who would be good at operating them, and who would be good at repairing and maintaining them, came out of the need for some sort of objective testing. And let me go to that slide. It came out of the need to help people to determine who would be good at doing those things. So you had those interrelationships. You had the development in psychology of the self. This started with the psychoanalytic movement, where you had, for the first time, really, the inquiry into how people thought, thinking processes, and of course, whether you agree or disagree with some of the factors that Freud came up with, Sigmund Freud came up with, he still had a major influence, and he himself laid the foundation for the types of counseling that we use today when we talk with people about who they are and about their insights and about self-understanding, where you had the development, the theorization through Freud of an id, an ego, a superego, and these factors combining and working in the individual, consciousness, subconsciousness, preconscious. All of these factors had not been thought of before, had not been investigated before. And that laid the foundation for the type of counseling that we do, particularly in terms of client-centered types of counseling, where we help people gain insight into behavior and have a belief that people have the power to change their behaviors. So those are some other influences that occurred and were beginning to occur during this time. Now, before we had counseling, before we had any sort of rehabilitation program, people would make career choices based upon several factors. Among those factors are that people would often follow in the footsteps of family members. When people would just get the basics in school and leave school once they knew how to read, write, do arithmetic, maybe even before then, trades and skills were learned by people following in the footsteps of family members. And very frequently, jobs that people did were based on class and social standing. Trades and skills were passed from one generation to the next. And also, there was limited job mobility. People didn't have access to transportation like we have today. And so people's ability to move to other locations, or the desire to move to other locations, really was not available or not present. And as I said before, we had family responsibility. Families would take care of themselves. Communities would take care of themselves. And people were self-sufficient in that regard. We didn't have a system of human services. We didn't have what today we might call a social safety net. And we didn't have, it wasn't until the first part really of the 20th century, the 1900s, and later on after that we had any ability to have mobility. There weren't automobiles until the first part of the 20th century. So people really were limited in terms of where they could travel, even getting to a job. If you think today that you hop in your car, or you take public transportation, and you go from your home to your workplace, which might be by car or public transportation, 15 minutes, an hour away, whatever it might be. Back in the late 1800s, without that mobility, you really had to be close to where you worked. I mean, you couldn't. There was no vehicle to hop into. There was no public transportation. And if you think today, how would you get from where you live to where you now work? Could you do that without transportation? Maybe you had a horse or something along those lines, or some other similar types of transportation, but it would take a long time to do. So people lived close to their jobs. We had extended families. The community looked after itself. We had the need for career counseling, as I said, as technology developed, as the industrial base increased. We had the need for counseling, and that need for counseling came about because of the requirements for career choice, because of the need to match people with jobs. And another way to say what I said before about designing and building and operating and maintaining equipment comes out of the need to identify the aptitudes required to do those things. And out of that came the fact that work became much more complex, and people had to specialize. And so people had to make decisions about what they were going to do and what they were going to be good at. And from that, in the first part of the 20th century, what we had was a man by the name of Frank Parsons, where he worked at a center called the Boston Guidance Center. That's Boston, Massachusetts. And he came up with a concept that we utilize to this day, which many of us will do and have done for ourselves, for friends and relatives, and for our consumers, and that is the concept of traits and factors. And basically what traits and factors are is that we look at the traits of the individual, what is inherent in the individual with regard to interests and abilities and functioning and aptitudes, what are they good at, and what are the requirements of jobs that we find, or factors that we find in the environment. What are the requirements of different jobs? And so the trait factor approach basically says, let's match people with jobs. Let's do a good job of matching people. And if we do that, what we're going to have is we're going to have job sustention, and people are going to stay on their jobs because they like them, and they're good at them, and they're able to do them successfully, and they're also going to be satisfied. They're going to have the interest to be able to continue doing that work. So we have job sustention as a result of that. And later on in the, I'd say the 1960s, I believe, we had the development of the Minnesota theory of work, which basically is a similar concept, where it's saying, at a more sophisticated level, but it's saying that you have to be able to match up the factors, the traits within the individual, and you've got to identify those traits, and that's what we do when we do testing of people, or we talk with people to find out what they are good at and what they are interested in, and we look at jobs to find out what are the requirements of those jobs, and then we look at what are the things that are required in those jobs, or in the different jobs, and we match people with jobs. And that's still an approach that we utilize today. And it's basically based on the work that Frank Parsons did back over 100 years ago. And I think a key factor here that's important for us to consider is it's not just that in rehabilitation we put people into jobs and then say, well, we got a good outcome, we got a successful outcome. It's the fact that we do a good job in identifying what the abilities are of the person. And when I say abilities, that's an umbrella for aptitudes and interest and academic functioning. And we get that very frequently through vocational testing or through interviewing the person and perhaps through psychological testing. And that we also look at the requirements of jobs and what is required to do that work and what are the types of satisfactions that people can derive from that work, and that we match people up. So it's not just someone having an aptitude to do a job, it's the interest in doing that work as well that I believe is also a critical factor. And very frequently the interest part of the equation is one that we don't give a lot of attention to. Very often people do jobs not because they're interested in them, but because they pay well or because they're available. And we often will neglect the interest aspect of it. And I'm a firm believer in determining what the interests are of somebody and what the temperaments are, what the where would someone best fit in into what kind of work environment. Now, having said that, I think that people can fit into a range of environments and have interest in a range of environments, not just one. So I don't think it's just identifying the one environment someone would do best in, but I think people can find satisfaction in a broad range of areas across different types of jobs. But I do think that it's important that we do that with consumers. And I think that if we just say, well, there's a job open over here, why don't you take it, and then we get a positive outcome, or a number that we can put down to say we got a positive outcome, I think we're doing our consumer a disservice, and ultimately we're doing our profession a disservice, even though we might be under pressure to place people into jobs. Long-term and long-range job satisfaction and job sustention is in large measure dependent upon the satisfaction that someone has, and by satisfaction, again, I mean interest in doing the work that they're doing. Now, in rehabilitation counseling, John McGowan, one of the initial or original theorists back, I would say in the 1950s, said that, in the 60s, basically said that the primary role of rehabilitation counseling is returning people to employment. And I would add to that yes, our goal is to return people to employment, but our goal also is to be able to ensure that people have a quality of life that will enable the individual to live and function independently, which is the next part of this slide, that we're helping move people from being dependent, and by being dependent, that can be dependent on various support systems, financial support systems, Social Security disability, long-term disability, worker compensation programs, even support from family members, to being as independent as possible. Now, of course, having said that, I certainly would be the first to recognize that none of us are fully independent, that we're all, to one degree or another, dependent on other individuals, other people. But what we want to do is to maximize the ability of somebody to be self-sufficient and to be independent. And as a result of that, we want to ensure that people have a quality of life that is reasonable and that allows for the ability to make choices and to be able to feel empowered as the person goes through the world and lives. So that's a little bit about the role of counseling that we have in rehabilitation. Let me talk briefly about what vocational rehabilitation is. The first question that arises is the question of what is a disability? And of course, when I use the word disability, I'm going to use that to talk about people with physical, mental, learning impairments, but technically, disability has different meanings in different contexts. So if we look at the definition of disability in public rehabilitation, that is going to be somewhat different than the definition of disability for Social Security benefits. It's going to be different than the definition that you might find in worker compensation. It may be different than what you find in the Americans with Disabilities Act. So very briefly, a disability in worker compensation is often defined as any harmful change in the human organism. Now, whatever that means, and who defines what's a harmful change in the human organism, that's debated quite a bit. In Social Security disability, the definition has to do with a person having a physical or mental impairment which prevents the person from being expected or able to do a significant number of jobs in the economy, which is which is expected to last for at least a year or result in death. Now, who defines what a significant number of jobs is? Well, that's left up to the Social Security Administration to determine that. In public rehabilitation, what we're looking at is a physical or mental impairment, and this definition kind of parallels the Americans with Disabilities Act, which limits one or more major life functions, and through the provision of rehabilitation services, the person is expected to be assisted with employment and independent living. Now, that definition of disability, or really it's a definition of eligibility, not so much disability, but that definition of disability is based on a person's functioning. So yes, we have to understand the physical, the mental, the learning impairment, but we're really looking at it in terms of its interface with the environment. And again, that goes back to what I said earlier about the trait factor approach. So we're looking at the impact of that disability on the environment. Now, if we're looking at disability from a medical model, what we'd be looking at would be what are the medical or the psychological factors that the person has. What is the physical impairment? What is the mental impairment? What is the diagnosis? What we do in rehabilitation, we take that a step further and say, well, yes, we need to understand that the person, let's say, has an amputation or of an extremity, or has a mental impairment such as bipolar disorder, manic depression, manic depressive disorder, or whatever the current term would be. We take that a step further and say, okay, now how does that impact the person's ability to function? And ability to function brings in other factors that we're concerned with. Those would include such things as the person's age, the person's prior educational level, the person's prior employment, the geographic region in which the person resides, as well as the support system which the person has, and also the abilities of the person, as we talked before about measurement of aptitudes and interests. So all of those factors come into play when we're looking at what rehabilitation is and what disability means in rehabilitation. And we have moved over the years from a model of rehabilitation as being a model based on the medical model, which is just looking at the physical and mental impairment exclusive of everything else, to more a model of function. So we're more concerned with function, and in making eligibility determinations, we're looking at the function of the person. And of course, we'll get into that in this class and in other classes. Now, to move on, I want to make a distinction when we talk about rehabilitation. And let me just, well, before I do that, let me just go to how disability is defined. And it's defined based upon objective tests. We want to know the medical and psychological aspects of the person. And we want to look at the functional abilities and not just the mental or physical functioning of the person. So we want to look at the total person when we are providing rehabilitation services. And a definition of rehabilitation, which is more an ideal that we would strive for than something that we always accomplish, is that we want to assist the individual achieve his or her highest level of functioning, commensurate with reasonable expectation, as well as the person's mental and physical abilities and external personal and societal factors. I think it's important for us to think that of trying to help people achieve as much as they can. And we want to do that within the parameters of what would be reasonable, considering a person's age and their educational level and their family and social functioning and their geographic location. So we want to help people achieve as much as they can, but that's modified to a certain extent by the concept of what is reasonable given other factors that the person has. Now, that doesn't mean that we're compromising with the person, but we have to be realistic with the person in terms of where the person is at and what the person's situation is. And again, we'll come back to this and see how this plays out in different situations. Let me make a distinction here in terms of the difference between habilitation and rehabilitation. When we talk about rehabilitation, we're really talking about including the concept of rehabilitation with the concept of habilitation. But I'm just going to break this out very briefly, because there are differences here in terms of how we function and how our consumers function based upon the nature of the disability and how and when it occurred. Habilitation, the concept of habilitation, which we really don't use, but I want you to at least think about it, because the consumers who would fall into this would have a different kind of perspective, different mental kind of outlook on things and perspective. Habilitation is associated with developmental disabilities, and it's associated with a person never had or acquired a particular function, and therefore it's associated with new learning, as opposed to rehabilitation, which is associated with traumatic or sudden onset of injury, and it's related to person having acquired skills and abilities, and it's associated with relearning or new learning. So even though we refer to rehabilitation incorporating this concept as well as the habilitation concept, it's also important to remember that the psychological aspects of somebody who's never learned a particular skill or trade or has never had employment is going to be different than someone who is injured at work, for example, and is, because of the injury, is unable to return to what he or she had been doing. And you get into a lot of issues of self-esteem and self-concept and role models and values and perceptions and many other things in those instances that are a little different in the habilitation area, where you have had someone who's never had those sorts of factors. And a definition of the rehabilitation process, and what we do in rehabilitation is a process, is that rehabilitation is a planned and orderly sequence of practices, services, and events designed to meet the needs of the individual in terms of assisting the person achieve his or her employment and independent living goals. And I think it's important for us to think about rehabilitation as being a process and a sequence. Now, of course, it's going to be different for everybody, and one of the unique factors of rehabilitation is that it is individualized, and it is not one size fits all, and it is not the same concept, the same approach in every instance, that everybody is going to have a different sequence of services and programs to help the person achieve employment and independent living goals. And that's because each person is going to have different employment and independent living goals depending upon who they are, what their situation is, and what they value and what they would like to achieve. Rehabilitation is an outcome-oriented system. I think that's important to understand as opposed to other types of human services. For example, if we take education, teaching, that certainly is outcome-oriented, but typically there is some sort of set curriculum and some sort of expectations that for everyone who goes through that system, they will achieve at a certain level of understanding or knowledge or competence. In rehabilitation, our process is a means to an end and not an end in itself. And as an outcome-oriented system, what we do is we individualize the curriculum or the program or the plan or the services to meet the needs and the goals of the individual. And as a result, we're a very pragmatic type of program. So as an example, if a person comes to us and has a learning disability and has been unable to learn how to read and comprehend at a level that would allow for entry into jobs requiring academic abilities, instead of trying to reinvent that wheel or trying to have the person go through and learn how to read and write as they had been through, and let's say in a school setting, we would say, okay, we're going to help you prepare for a job that would be a clerical type of job, but instead of having you go back and try to do remedial work, what we're going to do is we are going to teach you compensatory skills. So instead of having to say you got to memorize the multiplication tables, we're going to say let us teach you how to use a calculator. So those are examples, maybe not good examples, but those are examples. And as an outcome-oriented system, we in rehabilitation have three sort of broad domains, and those domains would be the input, process, outcome. Sometimes they're known by other names. Sometimes we implement these in different ways, but basically they amount to the same thing. In the input stage, we collect information. We gather information about the consumer. This can be from the consumer, him or herself, self-report. It can be from significant others. It can also be based upon objective information that we obtain when we send the person out for psychological or vocational or medical testing. It can also be based on existing information, existing records. And as we will see, one of the emphases in rehabilitation today, especially in this input stage, is that we use existing information. So that, as an example, if the individual has just come to us from a public school program and there's a myriad of records available to us regarding a person's academic functioning and various testing that was done along the way, and we can rely upon that. We don't need to send the person out for another vocational evaluation or educational evaluation, which would be time-consuming. If there's a psychological in the file and we feel that it's reasonable and valid, we can rely on that. If there are medical records from hospitalizations that have described medical procedures, we can rely on that. We don't have to send the person out again. In fact, it used to be, I remember years ago, every consumer virtually was sent out for what was known as a general medical evaluation, which really wasn't very in-depth or sophisticated, and it was based, on the person going out to one of these outpatient medical clinics and just getting a superficial examination. But even so, it was time-consuming, and a lot of that process was really not necessary. But in any event, our focus in the input stage is to collect information, obtain information, and then we use that information during this phase to help the person develop goals and objectives in terms of independent living and employment, and we help the person develop a plan to achieve those goals. And as a result of the input stage, if we're thinking about public rehabilitation, we would then develop an IPE, an individual plan for employment, which would specify the goal and the services and the anticipated outcomes. The second phase, the process phase, is where we would implement the rehabilitation plan. And the services that were initially described and discussed in the input stage would then be implemented. And obviously this can include training services, remedial services, it can include work adjustment services, it can include assistance with learning job skills, training, etc. And that would be the process phase or stage. And then the third stage would be the completion of the program, and that would be followed by job placement and follow-up and follow-along services. And that would be the outcome phase. And throughout all of these phases, I believe that we need to consider that we would be doing counseling and provide support services as the consumer goes through this process, through this rehabilitation process. And our counseling, the nature of our counseling, the nature of the support, would really depend upon how the person is doing, the individual needs of the person, and of course if adjustments need to be made, or if things are not working the way they were anticipated to be working, then we would need to adapt and adjust how we're doing that. Let me kind of go back a little bit and talk about how we evolved to where we are today. And I'm going to go into the history of rehabilitation, not today so much, not during this particular lecture, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the broad scope, the broad brush of rehabilitation history. And when rehabilitation first started, it first started by serving persons with the least severe disabilities. And the theory was, the philosophy was that it would be more cost effective to serve people who had the least severe disabilities, who had potentially the highest or the greatest likelihood of success, and as a result would cost the least amount of money to get the person back into the workplace. And that was the initial philosophy from the start of the rehabilitation program after World War I until about 1973, when that was kind of turned around, and since that time we began serving persons with severe disabilities. The next inclusion of individuals with disabilities were people with mental impairments, and as we will see, that occurred during the middle of World War II, And in part, that was done in order to be able to provide a labor force to assist in the war effort. So mental impairments, people with mental disabilities, were added at that time. Now, prior to 1973, and again, I'm going to, in another lecture, go into some of this history in more detail, but prior to 1973, there was a concept called social disability in the 1960s. And that concept of social disability was based in large measure on being an extension of the poverty efforts, the efforts to eradicate poverty that were done in the 1960s. And social disabilities could include people with who were viewed as economically disadvantaged, or who had drug and alcohol problems, or who had various other types of addictions. The problem that arose from that was that a social disability was viewed in and of itself as being a disability. And unfortunately, many people were served who were really not appropriate candidates for the type of program that rehabilitation is, or at that time was, and to a great extent currently is. And so what also happened during that time, the late 60s, early 1970s, is that people with mental and physical impairments were saying that they were not being served. And that led to the development of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, in which the emphasis was placed on serving people with severe physical and mental disabilities. It's not that people with so-called social disabilities could not be served after this time, after 1973. It's just that the individual also had to have some sort of physical or mental disability. And earlier I said that in many cases the people with social disabilities really didn't fit into the rehabilitation model. As an example, I remember viewing a program when I was in my doctoral program in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in which they told me, they were no longer doing this, but they were telling me that they were serving people who had had a social disability, and they were prostitutes. And they were viewed, prostitution in and of itself was a disability. And that just didn't work. Putting somebody who was in that profession, putting them in a rehabilitation facility where they were assembling widgets and being rehabilitated from their prior occupation just did not work. And so, in addition to people from the more traditional disabilities advocating for themselves in the early 1970s, you also had the fact that with social disability, it really wasn't effective. So in 1973, as a result of the Rehabilitation Act of 73, you had the inclusion of people, or the view of people with severe disabilities being given priority of service. And so the emphasis went from least severe disabilities to most severe disabilities. Of course, it was difficult to determine who is most severely disabled or severely disabled, and so there was much discussion during this time as to how that was defined. I think one simple way to look at it is that a person with a severe disability would have significant barriers to employment that would not be easily remediated. For example, if someone had the need for just eyeglasses or a hearing aid, that in and of itself would not qualify as being a severe disability. Doesn't mean that a person with a hearing impairment does not have a severe disability, but if just getting a hearing aid and the person can go back to the work that he or she was doing was all that was needed, that was not considered to be severe. However, if someone had a profound hearing impairment and perhaps that resulted in mental dysfunctioning or problems, that would be a severe disability. Or if someone just needed eyeglasses and they go to the optometrist or the ophthalmologist, get a prescription, they get eyeglasses, they go back to work, that's different than someone who has macular degeneration or is considered to be legally blind. So you had those sorts of differentiations. In the 1980s, what occurred was the inclusion of people with learning disabilities as being eligible for rehabilitation services. And this grew out of the parallel emphasis that was occurring in the 1970s in the educational system. And in the educational system, what was occurring at about the same time that the Rehabilitation Act of '73 was implemented was that there were educational laws that were put in place which basically said that all children were entitled to a free and appropriate public school education. And so that was implemented, and special education programs flourished. Not that they weren't already there, but they increased, they expanded. And what happened in the early 1980s was the fact that the children who were being served in public schools through the educational programs that were developed all of a sudden had a need for knowing what's next and what happens after school. And at what was after school, what they found was the public rehabilitation program. And what they also found was that instead of being an entitlement program, which was what the educational system was, you were entitled to educational services and programs, vocational rehabilitation is in essence an eligibility program. And not only is it an eligibility program, but even if you are found to be eligible, you might be included at a lower priority level than other people because of the severity of your disability or the number of other people who are also applying for services. One of the things that also occurred here was the fact that the concept of school, the public school educational system, if you take what I said before, that all children are entitled to go to school and can benefit from education, the special education people, when they looked at rehabilitation, not only saw an eligibility program, but they also saw a program that was in many ways very narrow in the sense of defining what a successful outcome would be. And to a great extent, a successful outcome was based upon employment in a competitive job. Now, of course, there are other outcomes, but that was that's the main emphasis, or had been the main emphasis. And what the special ed people were considering, and what they viewed and what they proposed, was that successful employment should be defined more broadly. In fact, one of the things politically that aggravated a lot of rehabilitation people is that, and maybe this was a reaction that shouldn't have been a reaction, but it was, is that they viewed individuals coming out of schools as with the notion that all people can work. So the special education people said, we view that everybody can go to school and benefit from school. We also view that everybody can work. And out of that notion, the notion of everybody can hold a job at some level, not necessarily in competitive employment, but out of that notion came the concept of supported employment, and that people can work, but the configurations of work may not be what we would normally consider traditional types of employment. And so we had supported employment developing, and the models, different models of supported employment developing in the 1980s. Okay. And then we had some refinements to the concept of severe disability. One of the major refinements was the fact that people with severe disabilities were viewed not only in terms of the disability, but eligibility for rehabilitation services was also modified. Eligibility was modified into the extent that the process was made more consumer, more user-friendly. It was people applying for services were feeling intimidated. They were feeling that they had to prove that they had a disability. And that's why I said some of the requirements for eligibility were modified, were softened to make it more user-friendly. And so, as I said before, some of the requirements for evaluations were eliminated, and alternate ways of evaluating people, such as existing information, were implemented. A requirement that eligibility decisions be made within a 60-day period was implemented. So we had things like that, and so that rehabilitation was viewed in a different way, and the concept of presumption that people would be able to benefit from rehabilitation services was implemented. So there were changes along the way in the late 80s and the 1990s to make rehabilitation more user-friendly and not as intimidating for people who were applying for services. We also had, during that time, the continued evolution of, which started in 1973 with the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, of consumer involvement in planning. So it wasn't just the counselor saying, well, this is the job that you're going to be trained for, that it became more one of the consumer having consumer choice, and the notion of choice was more prominent in the rehabilitation process, and the notion of the consumer being a partner with the counselor in the rehabilitation process was implemented. So we had these changes that were also occurring through various modifications to the Rehabilitation Act, as well as through just general practice that was implemented. What we also had occurring, which we'll talk about in another lecture, was the development and implementation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that had a profound impact on rehabilitation practice, as we will see, and also an impact on society. But I'm going to just talk about that just briefly in just a few minutes. Okay, rehabilitation is linked to society. Rehabilitation, as this is kind of summarizing some of the things we've talked about, rehabilitation is linked to societal values. It's linked to how we see ourselves as a society. Rehabilitation has been advanced, unfortunately, by wars, by conflicts. That, as we've seen, people with disabilities have been included because of conflicts, advances in testing, medical procedures, and we'll see the whole rehabilitation system was really developed in response to World War I. We also had the influence of other programs, as I've just talked about, the Education Acts and the concept of supported employment, and all people can go to work and can go to school. We have the notion of inclusive environments where supported employment and all people can go to work. We also had the movement away from physical facilities. It used to be, as an example, that and this made sense. If you think about it, it made sense, but it doesn't make sense, what I'm going to say next. And used to be one of the one of the primary approaches to doing vocational evaluations was for the rehabilitation facility to go out and survey what jobs exist in a community that are readily available, and then find ways in which people can be those jobs can be simulated so that people can be tested to see how good they are at doing those jobs. And logically, if someone is good at a job and that job exists in the community, and again, think trait factors again, then you train somebody to do that work. And that was very often how vocational evaluation and training was done. And that was done in a physical facility. In the 80s and 90s, there were movements away from that sort of evaluation, and we had movements towards more community-based assessment and community-based training, where you'd put somebody out in the community and you would evaluate how the consumer did in a job in the community. And it didn't have to be necessarily a job that existed in significant or substantial numbers. It could be a job that the person would be able to do, that it did exist in the community, and then the person was trained for that. Okay. So you had that also occurring since 1973. As I said, the Americans with Disabilities Act had a significant and profound impact on rehabilitation, and it had an impact not just in employment, or theoretically in employment. It didn't really have as great an impact in employment as people had hoped for. That's why there were amendments to and changes to the Americans with Disabilities Act in 2008. And when I talk about that piece of legislation, I want to be talking about that primarily from the employment perspective, and we'll talk about that and compare and contrast that with the notion of supported employment, and we'll talk about the employment provisions of the ADA with regard to their intent, what actually happened, and other factors that relate to the notion of supported employment and structuring and modifying jobs. We also had during the period, and again I'm thinking about since the 73 Rehabilitation Act, the reduction and elimination of institutions, particularly when I came into the field in the early 70s, the elimination not so much of rehabilitation facilities, because they still exist. They're known. They used to be known as sheltered workshops, and of course the notion of sheltered and a workshop had a stigma to it, and that term has been discarded. Those types of facilities still exist and still have an important place in the rehabilitation landscape and play an important role, but we refer to them more as community rehabilitation programs. But we also, so those didn't go away, but what did go away to a great extent were institutions for psychiatric disabilities, and that was a tremendous. That's been a tremendous change. And what it used to be, if a person were institutionalized because of a mental disability, that almost became a life sentence. That someone went into a mental hospital and they never came out until they died. And the reason for that was because the treatment and treatment options were not very good. People were given lobotomies, electric shock treatments, and the medications that were available until recently, when I say recently, the past 30 or 40 years, could not be fine-tuned. So they basically made somebody almost non-functional, as a zombie. And I'm not certain what a zombie is, but they made them non-functional. The more current medications allow people with mental impairments to be able to go back into the community and be able to function. And so you had a tremendous, profound change in how mental health services were delivered. And so now when somebody goes into a mental health facility for evaluation or treatment, it's a short-term placement, and people then go back into the community and are able to function in the community. Let me talk a little bit, to shift gears again on you, about what counseling is. And I know I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but I want to give kind of an overview. Counseling is something that we do throughout the rehabilitation process. And I think the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between what we do in counseling and what a therapist, a psychotherapist does in psychotherapy. Obviously, both are processes which involve a relationship between the professional and one or more persons seeking assistance. For example, if we did group counseling. The goal of both is to assist the individual achieve personal growth and optimum development. However, in psychotherapy, it's more long-term, it's more concerned with changes in personality and more concerned with abstract types of issues in general. Very frequently, psychotherapy is involved with unconscious processes, reconstruction of the past, understanding relationships, whereas counseling is less intense. Counseling deals more with here and now issues, educational decisions, family, social, vocational adaptations and adjustments. And counseling is educational, it's rooted in conscious awareness, it's rooted in problem solving, and it's rooted more in a here and now orientation. Although certainly for the counselor to be truly beneficial, often it does need to know something about the consumer's background. A man named C.H. Patterson proposed a continuum of helping relationships, and this is, to me, a neat way of sort of looking at some of the things that we do in counseling at different levels. At one level in counseling, we give people information. At another level, what we do is instruction. Another level is behavior therapy modification. And then a third level would be dealing more with relationship issues. And these range between cognitive thinking to affective, which would be emotional, personal, impersonal to personal, very specific information to more general information, learning to actual performance, and relationship as being kind of the medium where, you know, it's there because you have to have it in order to communicate information, to relationship as being essential. Let me kind of not leave you hanging on this. Information giving would be, for example, telling somebody you have an appointment with the medical doctor next Tuesday and you have to be there at 10 o'clock. That's information giving. Instruction would be teaching somebody how to write a resume. Teaching somebody how to search for jobs would be instruction. Behavior therapy or modification could be something like role playing, where we would role play a job interview. We would role play how to answer certain questions. That would be more in the behavior therapy or modification arena. And relationship issues would be perhaps taking that a step further, talking about how does the consumer feel about going out into a workplace where the person may have to deal with individuals who don't understand the disability or don't understand the person. That would be more relationship type of issues. And then if we go back to those cognitive affective, you can see on that continuum, cognitive would be just the thinking, affective would be more the interpersonal. And one is impersonal to personal. Specific would be something to the effect of you have this appointment on this date. General would be more along the lines of the talking and discussing the reasons why certain types of information would be needed and that can be obtained from certain types of evaluations and discussing the potential implications. Learning would be something like learning how to write a resume, as I said. Performance would be going out and actually interviewing after learning how to role play, or learning how to interview through role playing. And then relationship as medium would be just very simply, you have to have a relationship in order to be able to communicate at any level with somebody, even if it's just giving information. And relationship as essence would be if you're discussing interpersonal matters or discussing feelings or discussing adjustment issues, the relationship that you would have with the consumer would be essential. The research that's been done in counseling indicates that successful counselors of whatever nature they are, whether they're cognitive types of counselors, whether they are more relationship-oriented types of counselors, or somewhere in between, has 4 essential factors. And those essential factors, which we could probably spend, a whole semester on and more, those essential factors would be understanding the person from the person's perspective, empathetic understanding. And this, it's easy for me to say empathetic understanding, but it's much more difficult to implement, because we're always looking at a person through our own prism. We're always looking at situations with our own values, how we handled situations, our own backgrounds, our own upbringing, our own experiences. And we have to find ways to put that aside. We have to find ways to understand, to listen to the person, and listening skills are essential. We have to find ways in which we can understand the person from where the person came from, which may be very different from our own backgrounds and very different from our own experiences. And the only way we do that is by understanding the person from the person's perspective. And developing empathy is not easy. It takes a lot of work, and it's important that we not make assumptions about people. It's important that we not make presumptions, that we not assume things, and that we try to understand the person and the person's values from where that person has been, where they currently are, and perhaps even where they're going, where they want to go. As a result of that, if we do a good job of demonstrating empathy and demonstrating an understanding of the person from the person's perspective, we're going to be able to show that person positive regard or respect. And I think this sometimes creates conflicts for us as professionals. Sometimes it creates some ethical dilemmas for us, because we'd say, well, what if we have somebody who is repulsive to us, who's done something that we find repulsive? How do I have empathy for that, or how do I have respect for that? And that's a good question. That is a good question. I think that in general our approach would be to respect individuals, to try to understand individuals, to not impose our values on persons, to display empathy, not sympathy for people, to be able to say, well, the things that you did, might not be valued by society, but that doesn't mean that there are not positive things that you have to offer, and there are not positive ways or ways in which we can help you to be able to move forward and be able to successfully function in society. And I would try to view people as, even though they might have done things that are repulsive to us, to view people as in my general philosophy, as wanting to do the right thing, whatever that broad right thing is, within the context of our general society and our general functioning. And you know, people don't always do what we would consider the right thing, and I put that in quotes. But I do think that that trying to understand people, respect people, to not patronize people, I think is the direction that we go in. I think to a certain extent, I believe that we're also a little protected in terms of the consumers who would be referred to us. By the time we get a consumer, the consumer has probably been through a lot of other programs, and so the truly consumers, incorrigible consumers, are probably not going to find their way through the rehabilitation system. The consumers who find their way to us are probably going to be individuals who have been deemed to have the potential to be able to go out and successfully function in society. Now, there are exceptions, obviously, so we may not be faced ultimately with many consumers who we are just going to have great difficulties working with. And I do think that there are situations that arise where there'll be a consumer who comes to us and for whatever reason, we're just not able to work with that person. And I don't think that's going to be common, but I think it's going to be something that will on occasion happen. And if that were to happen, I think then we would need to take appropriate actions to refer that person to somebody else. Genuineness is basically being who you are, and I think that is part of being successful with empathy and respect, because these all intertwine. If you are who you are, the person will be able to will be able to have a better sense that you do truly understand that person and you do truly respect that person. If you're trying to pretend you are somebody you're not, that lack of genuineness, that insincerity, will come through, and the person won't trust you. And if the person closes up to you, then it's very difficult to establish a good counseling relationship, a good rehabilitation relationship, and it would be difficult for the person to be able to respond to you in a way that would be effective for the long-term outcomes that the person wants to achieve. So being who you are, genuine, is an important factor, and includes part of the empathy and the respect that you're attempting to develop with consumers. And the fourth component is concreteness. And basically, concreteness means that you're not throwing out, professional terms, and you're not throwing out, jargon that only you and others in the field understand. That you're translating things so that the person understands, and the person can relate to. And again, that factor combined with genuineness reinforces respect and positive regard, as well as empathetic understanding. So these four factors are present in all positive, effective counseling relationships. And what we do as counselors is, in general, as an overview, we do counseling, we do problem solving, we help people with career and personal choices, establish goals. We also help in terms of coordinating services. We also help people to work with other professionals. I don't have it phrased very well here, but we help people basically to interface with other people, other professionals in training programs, employers with community resources. And our counseling functions include such things as vocational counseling, affective counseling, which can fall also into the personal adjustment realm. We would work with groups, doing group counseling, and we would also do counseling and work with significant others. And before I'd leave the significant other factor, let me just state that I also believe it's important that we get on board in the rehabilitation process significant others. That significant others, I believe, play an important role in working with consumers. And significant others are important with regard to success of the rehabilitation program. If the consumer's significant other is not on board with what we're doing, the significant other or family members could readily undermine what it is that we are doing. They could undermine our program. They could sabotage what we're doing, and we don't want that to happen. And the consumer typically doesn't want that to happen. And a way to address that, not the only way, but a way to address that is to have consumers part of the process. Obviously, with the approval of our consumer, but consumers may be influenced not just by us, but significant others can be influential, and they may have questions for us. As an example, if we have a consumer on Social Security disability, and we're talking about using the Ticket to Work program to get the consumer back into employment, and the person does want to go into employment, that we might find significant others, a significant other might have some doubts about that, and might influence the consumer to say, no, you don't want to go back to work, because if you go back to work, you're going to lose your benefits. And what happens if you lose your benefits and then you can't work anymore? They're going to turn around and say, well, you're not eligible anymore for disability because you were working, and that might sabotage what we do. And so addressing those issues and addressing the concerns that might arise, I think, is a very important factor in success, ultimate success. So I'm not hesitant at all to involve consumers and their significant others, because I do think that's an important phase and that we're aspect, and we're not just dealing with the individual. We're dealing with the individual and his or her significant others. In counseling, as I said, we deal with vocational issues, educational issues, mental health issues, family, social issues, disability issues. You might have a consumer concerned who uses a wheelchair, concerned about adjustment to work and the need to catheterize, and so we would need to deal with those types of issues. In rehabilitation, kind of have a hierarchy of rehabilitation, where we go from, and I'm not certain this is any particular order, but psychological, emotional adjustment, physical safety issues, social family issues, economic security and self-esteem, and vocational self-actualization. And I guess number 5, vocational self-actualization, would be the highest level. And if we can have somebody be not self-employed, but be employed, then they become self-sufficient. And that certainly, if we're thinking about this as dominoes, self-sufficiency leads to economic independence, which leads to a person being able to live and function independently, and leads to helping the person being able to have a good quality of life and be able to feel in control of his or her life. In some of our rehabilitation processes, things that we do, again, to kind of reiterate some of these things, we work with community groups to identify appropriate consumers. We work with hospitals, schools, educational institutions, private clinics to identify consumers. We educate people in the community about who would be an appropriate consumer. We collect information on consumers. We do rehabilitation planning, goal determination, implement plans. We also work with employers. We educate employers. We train employers to be able to know what some of the issues are with employment of people with disabilities, some of the modifications that might be beneficial. And so instead of being adversarial, we can be advocates for consumers, we can empower consumers, and we can work collaboratively rather than adversarially with people in the community, whether those are potential referral sources or employers or other professionals. Our roles and responsibilities, kind of saying what I've said already in a different way: case finding, identification of appropriate consumers. We determine eligibility, and one of our primary factors is to actually determine eligibility. Is someone eligible, and how and the severity of a disability that a person might have. In some cases, we administer tests, we interpret tests, we make referrals for medical, psychological, educational testing, evaluation, and training. We provide counseling services. We also coordinate with other professionals and community agencies. We do vocational planning and training. We determine comparable or similar benefits, where we look at resources the person might be eligible for to utilize in the rehabilitation process to pay for services. We assist with helping people adjust to work, learn how to function in the workplace appropriately, and we may also, as part of that process, help people in terms of personal adjustment counseling. We work in the community to do community development and public relations. In some instances, we're actually we become supervisors or administrators of programs. We advocate. We provide assistance to consumers. We try to empower consumers. We work with employers to develop job opportunities. We do direct job placement. We analyze jobs, and we make recommendations for job modifications. And again, I'm going to come back to this, particularly in terms of the ADA. When we talk about the ADA, I'm going to come back to some of these concepts. As I said earlier, we do community-based assessment. We do training in the community. We follow up with consumers. We develop referral sources. We develop employment sites. We do employability skill development with consumers, which can include resume writing and developing of job search strategies, job identification, interviewing, grooming with consumers. We do evaluation and monitoring, ongoing counseling. As I said, resource development, job placement, employment, follow-up services. We look at change issues. We help the consumers develop new knowledge. We look at the beliefs of the consumer, attitudes of consumers, motivation, behavior. We help people be able to take these areas, expand these areas, and apply them so that they can be successful in the community and be able to transition from being, as I said at the beginning of this particular lecture, from transition from being dependent to being independent. Let me talk just very briefly about eligibility. We do eligibility determinations. As I said, that's an important function. We look at physical functioning, psychological functioning, vocational functioning. We rely upon existing school and hospital records. We rely upon other existing information, self-reported and anecdotal information from significant others and from the consumer. And we take that information, we try to translate that in terms of functional abilities, and we translate that in terms of the types of jobs that the person can do. And in other classes, you'll learn about the sources of occupational and vocational information that we utilize. The basic eligibility criteria is in public rehabilitation is the person has a physical, emotional, or learning disability, which we identify by objective tests, existing medical and psychological records. And we then determine if the person has one or more barriers to life functioning. Barriers can include such things as mobility, self-care, employment, social functioning, education, communication. We look at the presumption of benefit, the ability of the person to benefit from vocational rehabilitation services in terms of employment and self-sufficiency. We determine the severity of the disability that the person has, and we then make these eligibility determinations. That's in our purview. And we look at services that we can help to identify so that the person can achieve a positive employment outcome. And we look at the issues in the areas that we've talked about, medical and psychological, training, adjustment, employability, that would be necessary for the person to be successful. And we look at outcomes in terms, and we were talking about this before, but outcomes in terms of competitive employment, supported employment, where the person might have work, where they work in some sort of work group, or they have job restructuring, job sharing. People can work in facilities, rehabilitation facilities. We can look at self-employment or business enterprise programs, such as the Office for the Blind offers or has, home employment, and independent living issues. These would be typical outcomes. We also have to be concerned with ethical issues. There'll be more training on ethics. We're always learning about ethics. But some of the basic issues here would be how we collect and handle consumer information, confidentiality issues, relationship issues, disclosure of information to third parties, which can include significant others or employers or referral sources. And one that's not on here is making sure that we stay within our professional boundaries as rehabilitation professionals, that we don't go in and do things that we're not qualified to do, that we're not making medical diagnoses or psychological diagnoses or providing psychotherapy when we're not trained to do these sorts of things. So those will be some ethical issues. And that wraps up this particular lecture. We're going to expand on all of this as we proceed.